On November 7, 1983, the Soviet General Staff went to silent nuclear alert. The cause was a NATO command exercise called Able Archer 83 that the Soviet military intelligence apparatus had misread as the operational rehearsal of an actual first strike. For roughly 6 days, much of the Eastern Bloc's strategic forces sat at a readiness level that had not been seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The American public was never told. The intelligence officers handling Western collection inside the target environment that month felt it precisely. They were the ones reading the indicators in real time, in places where being wrong by 24 hours would have been the difference between an exercise and an extinction event. If you came of age inside the intelligence trade between roughly 1965 and 1985, you were the cohort sitting at the analyst desk and the agent meeting and the listening post during that incident. And what I am about to walk you through, most public histories never bothered to put together, not because it is complicated, but because it requires actually paying attention to the generation of operatives that spent its whole career not asking anyone to pay attention to it. That would be you. So stay with me. Here is what intelligence assessment data from the early 1980s actually found when researchers inside the agencies asked Cold War operatives what kept them mentally engaged on the job. First answer, making sure the deterrent stayed deterrent. Second, making sure the strategic assessment stayed accurate enough that decisions made on top of it would not become catastrophic. Not promotion, not paycheck, the deterrent and the assessment. You came up in a service that ran on a very specific kind of background noise. Not loud, not constant, but always on, like the hum of a refrigerator. Except this refrigerator was the strategic balance of 2 nuclear powers, and the cost of a misread was civilizational. The Soviet Union had several thousand warheads. The United States had several thousand more. Your service was the layer between them and the assumption set that the leadership on each side used to decide whether the other side was preparing to launch.
That is the job you came of age inside. And then, on the morning of November 9th, 1983, your station chief sat you down and explained that the exercise the West had been conducting had nearly produced exactly the scenario the deterrent had been designed to prevent. ABC, the American television network, would air a film called The Day After, 11 Days Later. 100 million Americans would watch a TV movie about Kansas getting flattened by Soviet warheads with no rescue at the end. You were watching real cable traffic. You did not need the dramatization. The Wikipedia public archive on that era notes something that intelligence historians have pointed to ever since, that this confluence of events, Able Archer, the Pershing II deployment, the rhetoric around Star Wars, the cumulative pressure of operating in a target environment that had genuinely misread the entire situation, was a major reason for what became your generation of operatives' trademark stoicism, a composure under operational stress that was sometimes mistaken by analysts who came up later for emotional disengagement. And that tracks, because here is the logic, and it is not unsound logic. If the strategic balance can actually fail on a Tuesday, why are you stressed about the interdirectorate memo? You stayed calm, but you stayed calm while doing the work. That is not detachment. That is something else entirely, and it came from somewhere very specific. By 1980, the CIA's Directorate of Operations was running asset programs inside the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries at a tempo that had no precedent in the agency's history. Officers were being recruited and trained at the highest annual rate the Directorate had sustained since the late 1940s. If you joined the trade in 1968, you were 35 when Able Archer happened. If you joined in 1975, you were 28, right in the operational thick of it.
Now, think about what that actually meant. Your senior officers, the post-war generation, were the cohort that had decided strategic risk tolerance was something you absorbed personally without burdening the next level up. That is the deal. But you were the experiment. You were the one watching that doctrine get applied in real operational time, and there were a lot of you. Internal CIA personnel data, partially released through later FOIA channels, suggests that between 40 and 50% of Operations Directorate officers active in 1983 had entered service between 1965 and 1975. And whether your station chief was supportive or remote, whether your training had been thorough or rushed, the message that came through the institutional walls, not always spoken but felt, was this: figure it out yourself. Do not make noise. Be operationally fine. So you did. You became very, very good at looking operationally fine, at sitting with strategic anxiety that had no name and no outlet and just carrying it, at not asking the next level up to slow down on your behalf. You probably did not even realize you were doing it. It was just the air. But all that time you thought you were just surviving the era, you were actually training. Training for what? That is where this gets interesting. There is a body of intelligence organizational psychology that has been quietly developing in academic journals since the late 1990s. The short version: the cohort of operatives raised inside the late Cold War nuclear standoff developed cognitive habits: radical composure, high tolerance for ambiguous threat indicators, sharp situational humor as a release valve, a refusal to panic on incomplete information that the trade has been quietly relying on ever since. The Journal of Strategic Studies has run multiple analytical retrospectives on the period documenting the same finding. Your generation of operatives is the one most cited for steadiness under unverifiable strategic threat. That is not an attack on the cohorts that came later. It is a description of what the conditions of your training built into you.
What you built out of that nuclear backdrop, without knowing you were building anything, was operational armor. Specifically, a very sharp situational humor, a high tolerance for chaos in the collection environment, a radar for institutional inflation, and ability to walk into any broken assessment and say, "All right, what do we actually know here?" while everyone else is still constructing scenarios. The directors of Central Intelligence during the post-Cold War period made careers out of pointing leadership briefings at officers who had operated in this environment and saying, "When something has to land, it lands here." Internal CIA leadership composition data from the late 1990s onward, referenced in a 2025 historical study published through the Center for the Study of Intelligence, found that operatives who had come up between 1965 and 1985 held a disproportionate share of senior operational and analytical leadership across multiple agencies for the entire post-Cold War period. The generation that nobody wrote trend pieces about, the generation that learned to absorb strategic risks silently, was quietly running a very large portion of Western intelligence for the next 30 years, and almost nobody made a big deal about it, which is, honestly, very on-brand for you. Okay, so you survived the nuclear standoff, built the operational armor, figured everything out, got into your 40s and 50s, things started to feel maybe like they were finally making sense. And then the post-war generation of senior officers started to retire, and the millennial trainees did not arrive on schedule. There's a name for this: the sandwich cohort, and your generation is right in the middle of it. Aging mentors who were the last people inside the building who remembered how the work had actually been done at the operational peak, and a rising tier of trainees who had grown up entirely inside the post-9/11 doctrine and had no reference for the strategic ambiguity environment your cohort had operated in.
A study by the Rand Corporation published in 2024 on intelligence community succession dynamics put some numbers on how this is going. A significant majority of officers in the sandwich cohort reported elevated cognitive load, up sharply from the previous decade. The average officer in this situation was carrying mentor obligations to 2 retiring senior analysts and training obligations to 3 to 5 rising junior officers simultaneously, on top of their caseload. And the operatives in this cohort were also the ones carrying the heaviest residual mission load from the Cold War portfolios that had never fully been closed. So you were working a caseload, managing the institutional handoff from the cohort above you, training the cohort below you, trying to figure out what you were going to do about your own service retirement, which is coming faster than the operational plan accounted for, and doing most of this without telling anyone how heavy it actually is. That is not weakness. That is what it looks like when the cohort that learned to absorb strategic risk silently keeps absorbing it, even when the institutional pile gets unreasonable. And the thing about a cohort that was never taught to ask for help is they mostly do not ask, which means a lot of you are going through the institutional handoff completely alone, in a way that does not look like struggle from the outside. You look like you have it handled, and maybe you do, but handled and operationally okay are not the same thing, and you learned that distinction better than anyone. Let me go back to the strategic balance for a second. Your service, the one you came up inside, had the highest operational tempo any Western intelligence agency had run in peacetime history. You watched that environment up close. You felt what it did to operations officers. You carried it. And when you grew up inside the trade, what did you do? You took the strategic posture more seriously than the cohort before you. You designed assessment products with more skepticism baked in. You insisted on multi-source confirmation in ways that your predecessors had often skipped. And once you committed to an analytical position, you held it without flinching when leadership pushed back, because you had been trained by the era that taught you what wishful analysis cost.
The internal historical assessment of analytical product quality across the 1970s through the 2000s, referenced in Robert Jervis's Why Intelligence Fails and the related Princeton University press literature, has documented this directly. Analytical rigor at the national intelligence estimate level rose measurably across the period your cohort dominated and held steady at that elevated level for years afterward. That improvement did not fall from the sky. You saw the failure patterns of the cohort before you, you decided you did not want them, and you quietly did the work of doing something different. Nobody wrote a trend piece about that, by the way. It just happened. And then there's what you did as senior officers. The cohort that received the least mentoring, the least debrief support, the least let us talk about the operational cost coaching, grew up and created station environments where the operational cost was actually discussed. Your cohort was the first inside Western intelligence to regularly put psychological load language into senior briefings, to mentor the rising tier in ways your own seniors never attempted, to tell the next generation officer out loud that the work they were carrying was real and would leave residue. The post-9/11 cohort of operatives gets written up as the emotionally aware generation, the generation that finally made it okay to talk about operational mental health. But that entire institutional playbook, you wrote it first. You built the thing. They got to grow up inside it. You built the runway. They got to fly on it. No credit, no internal cultural moment dedicated to it. Just you doing what you have always done, figuring it out, not making noise about it.
Let me put this together. You came up inside the highest tempo nuclear standoff in modern history and called it Tuesday. Your operational environment got complicated and you learned not to burden the next level up with it. You turned all of it, the strategic ambiguity, the unverifiable threat indicators, the years of being handed the message, be operationally fine and figure it out, into a very specific skill set, one that Western intelligence has now spent 30 years quietly relying on without properly naming. Something is happening now, though, quietly, in the senior years of your cohort. Officers like you are starting to name what you have been carrying. There are oral history projects collecting it. There are internal studies. There are debrief sessions full of officers saying things like, I am only now realizing I never processed any of it. Or, I thought being operationally fine was the same thing as being okay. Turns out they are different things. The senior officers' associations across the Western intelligence services are now circulating reading lists on what the historical record is calling delayed operational integration.
the process by which a generation of officers raised under uniquely heavy strategic conditions arrives in their senior years with the realization that the operational armor kept everything out, including sometimes their own feelings about the work they did. That is not an institutional crisis. That is just the timing of things. You did not get space to look at any of it when it was happening. You were too busy being operationally fine. You were too busy carrying the work. And the service, the agency, the country, needed you to keep going. So you kept going. And now there is a little more room. Not a lot, but some. And a lot of you are using it.
Here is what the historical record will eventually say about your cohort. You took the most strategically anxious operational environment in modern intelligence history, nuclear standoff, doctrinal upheaval, an institutional culture that gave you almost no debriefing infrastructure, and turned it into officers who are more composed under unverifiable strategic pressure than any cohort around them. You watched your senior officers underprepare the next generation and quietly built better handoffs. You received no model for emotionally honest mentorship and invented one for the cohort below you. You got handed less institutional support than any operational generation before or after you and ran more of the trade than the numbers should have allowed. And you did it all without a press release. The composure people saw and called detachment was not detachment. It was the same operational habit running underneath every other thing your cohort did. You still showed up every shift. That is not armor. That is character. And there is a difference. What you built inside that strategic environment is the part of modern intelligence history that has been slowest to find its place in the public record. But it is there in every after-action assessment, every senior leadership chair, every operational handoff that runs cleanly to the cohort that came after you. The work you carried in silence was real, and quiet does not mean it did not count.